Good afternoon, everyone. We're so happy that you're here for this fourth and final session of the Land Institute's Ecosphere Studies 2020 Digital Gathering. I'm Aubrey Stray-Krug and delighted to welcome you. We are going to begin the session, like the others, with a contemplative video. This video was taken at the Land Institute's Wahab Prairie, and many gatherings at the Land Institute conclude with conversations and reflections at Wahab, which overlooks our research plots as well as the Smoky Hill River to the west. Wahab is a hilltop prairie remnant whose ecospheric community has held on for a long time. And in this video, we'll walk down Wahab into the Kernza perennial grain research plots.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for taking that walk with me. Our research director, Tim Cruz, reminded me that I might have been filming the Kernza alfalfa research plots. I don't know if I did the alfalfa justice in that video, but trust me, it was doing good work there as well. So I'm going to begin this session with just a reminder of the session theme about community courage, and use that to introduce our two people who are going to be talking with us today and sharing their wisdom. And I wanted to begin with a quotation I heard recently from an activist, Erica R. Miners, who's a prison abolition activist. And their line is, "Liberation under oppression is unthinkable by design." Liberation under oppression is unthinkable by design. It's no accident. And when I heard that, my gut response was, it may be made to be unthinkable, but it's certainly not unfeelable. I think we can feel liberation. In other words, there are people, especially artists and writers, whose work challenges us to feel liberation. And not to stop there, but to use that feeling as a starting place for work going forward and for the work of courage at this moment. And for me, Carmen Cristina Moreno and Dar Jamal are two of those people. So I'll start with Carmen. Carmen is an interdisciplinary artist whose ways of engaging science, ecology, culture, and land grow from her participation in communities ranging from urban Kansas City to ranchlands in Mexico. I met Carmen in the summer of 2017 at an Ecosphere Studies workshop at the University of Kansas. And my first memory of her is her passionately challenging the underlying assumptions of one of the texts that we had been discussing. We went on to have a great conversation, and over the years I've learned so much from her and have been able to collaborate with her on a series of artistic projects, including West Bottoms Reborn, which is a project in Kansas City that Carmen developed programming for, and Earth Body, her 2019 series of workshops for people of color in Kansas City that she'll share some more about. Dar is an award-winning journalist whose reporting on war and ecological harm grows from his travel around the world and his love and affection for mountains. I first learned of Dar's work when my friend and mentor, Mary Pfeiffer, attended a workshop with the eco-psychologist Joanna Macy, and Dar had also participated in that workshop. Mary came back and shared some of his work with me. Later, Bob Jensen shared with me Dar's book, The End of Ice, Bearing Witness and Finding Meaning in the Path of Climate Disruption. I expected it to be informative and moving, and it was, of course, but I was really surprised by how profoundly helpful Dar's narrative was for me to read. I didn't know that I needed it, but I needed it. Dar is currently at work on a collaborative project with Stan Rushworth that's titled The Changing Earth, Indigenous Voices from Turtle Island. So thank you, Carmen and Dar, for being here with us today. And the first question that I'd like you to respond to and begin speaking about is just beginning with your grounding in the ecosphere, and where each of you has found a source of guidance and grounding in your life. So maybe you can share a little bit about the emotions you felt and worked with in the course of deepening your relationship with particular communities and places. Carmen, I'm thinking especially of your work with mushrooms and mycelium, and Dar, I'm thinking, of course, about mountains with your work. So Carmen, would you lead off for us?
Sure. So I actually have some images just to kind of go over my relationship to farming and agriculture and mushrooms and how it plays a huge role in thinking about redesigning future systems. So I could screen share that now if you guys are ready. Okay. So do you have a full screen share, or do you have, yeah. So I just wanted to kind of introduce myself. Some of you I know from previous things at the Land Institute, but just to give you a background, my father's from Mexico. I come from multiple generations of farmers. I've done a lot of exploration about immigrant farm work and what it means to kind of change agricultural practices from generation to generation. I am an artist. I look a lot at identity, art, ecology, and time. I take into considerations all these different factors within the ecosystems that I'm exploring. And I use those textures and biomimicry to kind of create artwork and work emotionally intuitively. So really today I want to talk about my relationship to mushroom and mushroom as a guide for me throughout my life to kind of inform me about ways to live and ways to practice. So for me, mushroom is my guide. It was my chosen guide. It's a grounding principle, and I just want to kind of iterate. Guide can be a person, an entity, and guide can also be an action. For me, the biggest lesson of fungi, I'm going to kind of quote Peter McCoy here, all life is interconnected. This is the primary lesson that fungi teach us. Fungi may be the primary source of carbon for the whole soil and micro communities. So for me, what I have noticed right now, socially, there are huge disparities or disassociations from relationship to each other as humans and then relationship to planet. So humans as a living organism or a social sphere kind of became my focus, and I became interested in communitarianism. So communitarianism is the philosophy that emphasizes the connection between the individual and the community. Its overriding philosophy is based upon the belief that a person's social identity and a personality are largely molded by the community relationship, with a smaller degree of development being placed on individualism. A leader of the American communitarian movement pointed out that communities can be defined with reasonable precision as having two characteristics. First, a web effect, Latin relationships among a group or individuals, relationships that often crisscross, reinforce one another. And second, a measure of commitment to set shared values, norms, meanings, and a shared history of identity. In short, a particular culture. So this is a photo. I'm a wild mushroom hunter. I took this photo just to kind of show the basic Latin structures that we know mycelial networks have within the ground, creating fruiting bodies. I want to go into another realm. How does the mushroom inform us within design? How can we think of, how can we take old systems of kind of being boxed in and look at life in a new way and perceive our social systems not as something that's that has boundaries as a domain, but is limitless ability to grow. So a moment that I thought was really interesting when I was at the Land Institute was we were discussing how to get educational materials, how to build an ecosphere community. And I remember mapping the ideas of how that could move across Kansas, and someone kind of came up with the idea like, oh, like we should go about it in a way that we designate growth through county. And I remember having that visual stimulant of looking at the map and being like, oh, it's just a bunch of boxes. Like, how is that a real growth system? How do you coordinate these types of community growth in a way that doesn't seem very relevant to how life actually works? And so here's another map of Kansas, shows you all the waterways and topography, a hydrological map, a veinous system that carries information, carries life, and is a living network within its own. So in a lot of ways, I look at mycelium as an informant, and that its form of growth is kind of all around us. It's in the cosmogenesis, it's in the planet, it's in our very own bodies. And these sorts of ways of looking at nature can become very informative to how we think about cityscape or metropolis, how we can live together as a larger social organism in ways that create an ecosystem that's sustainable, but also uses nature as a model for what type of kind of organism or environment that we want to create. So just to reiterate, this is a human cell, and then this is also a map of Paris. Here's a map of Kansas City roadways, thinking about all these layers of city design, rail yards, highways, roads, water systems. And then on the other side, we have a petri dish with a mycelial growth. And so we're thinking about city designs as a way, think about nature can inform city design as like a large metropolis, but then we can also look at other things in artistic history, architectural history, things like Earthship that design interior spaces, architectural spaces for people to live in that are sustainable. Paulo Soleri, these architects kind of did off-the-grid experimental projects and thinking about how to design and live within nature. But then how do we come from the cosmogenesis to the metropolis directly down into the body? What is it within our own world that is a house or a home or a living organism that needs to be nurtured and that needs to be healed and taken care of? So the idea was like going into the home and looking at all these structures that mimic the body. We can see in plumbing systems really, basic way of showing that, like it's mimicking an intestinal tract. It's mimicking what it means to digest. What would it mean to design plumbing systems and waste management that had its own microbiome, that mimicked the body, that mimicked living ecosystems that could manage vast amount of waste in a real sustainable way. So we know for sure that our systems don't work. It's problematic. We can't apply racist policies. We can't apply false sense of reality onto the earth. We can't map it into our cities. We can't map it into our architecture and infrastructure or social networks, and we can't map it onto our body. Technology kind of reiterates these ways of compartmentalizing life. It can produce an element of growth and information, but essentially we are a living network and we need to design as a global living network. So I'm very interested in how social systems can learn from natural systems and the ecosystems, how the small can be projected into the macro, and how we can look at things like the mushroom and learn how to design with integrity and care in a real way that takes into consideration the whole living network. So just to kind of end it there, this is a photo of mushrooms busting through concrete. And so in a time of resistance, we might look at, some people might perceive nature as something that's fragile, but here we get to see this moment where this soft-bodied mushroom busts through the asphalt and creates new life and renewed energy. So just to like touch base on the Earth Body Project, I took all those concepts, I integrated them into classes for POC people. They were a mix of art and ecology. They were led by POC teachers and they were open to POC community. So the idea behind this was really to look at nature as a model and recreate social networks that could grow from a place of a positive observation and just provide space to collectively commune in places where there are many barriers to entry within social system.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carmen. I love that image of the courageous mushroom, the softness of that and the power of that softness. So Dara, I'll turn it to you now. I'd love to hear your response to the opening question.
Yeah, well, thank you, Aubrey, and thank you, Carmen. And I want to first just thank everyone at the Land Institute for doing what you do. And I feel really, really honored to be part of this online conference. It's really, so much amazing work being done for the planet. So to be able to be included in that and just share a few things I'm really humbled and honored by it. And then on the theme of the Wendell Berry poem from the last session, I just wanted to carry forward on that theme. So in my book, I actually took a part of it that Bob had read and recited there and included about there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. And I think as talking about the earth, we humans as being part of the earth included in that as well, of course. So when I thought about what to talk about today and thought about guidance with this first question, the no-brainer thing that came out for me was obviously mountains. That once I got out of college, I too was a captive of Texas like Bob. I went to Texas A&M University, and once I graduated, I promptly escaped to Colorado to be near mountains. And I realized when I look back over my life from this point that I've always oriented myself geographically in proximity with mountains so that I could always go up into them. They're my church, I guess. And so when I saw Denali in Alaska the first time in 1996, this tractor beam hooked on to me. And so I moved up there and just knew I need to be up there, and it wasn't about summiting or anything like that. It was just being in that place. And it was by following that, I was on Denali when the Iraq War broke out in 2003 and had been tracking it up to that point. And it was on Denali where I really got the guidance to go over there and write about it. And it wasn't really an intellectual decision. It was just this pull, just like how the mountain pulled me up to Alaska, but it was really this pull on my heart, like, you need to go over there. And so I basically sent myself over to Iraq, and that turned into a career in journalism, writing about the war over the next 10 years, which then led into other things. But a few years into that, I just kind of in concert with talking about the emotionality of this broader topic for this discussion, that in 2006, I actually went to my first Joanna Macy intensive, and I had severe PTSD from doing a lot of frontline Iraq war reporting. And classic PTSD, I was either numb or could feel rage. Like I'd read the news and see what was happening, more Iraqis being killed by US troops or car bombs, and I just white hot rage, similar to the rage I see today when, just recently in Seattle, a fascist drives a car into a Black Lives Matter protest and kills somebody and sends someone else to the ICU. So like, that's all I could feel though. And I was sitting there for about 3 days in a Joanna Macy, basically a grief workshop. And it took about 3 days for it to break. And then it did. And then the tears flowed and they just wouldn't stop. And at one point I remember sitting right next to Joanna, probably about 5 days into it. And she just looks over to me and says, "You're just my little faucet." Because I just couldn't stop, and that's what was really below the rage, was deep grief, deep sadness about what was happening. And then fast forward to 2016, 10 years later, I'm working on my book about the climate crisis, and I'm at another Joanna Macy retreat, this one at Ghost Ranch in New Mexico. And she was having me each morning get up and kind of give a synopsis of the news to the group, because part of what happens in these things is they didn't want people to be online having the constant intake of information. And so I would kind of the night before go through and just get a few points on each topic and then present that to the group. And then she stopped me one day and said, "What's it like for you to carry what you know?" And this was like about war, about the climate. And and it really made me start looking again deeper inside, like emotionally, what does that mean? And all of us here on this online conference, in all of our different works, are carrying big chunks of grief about what we know about what's happening to the planet from all of our different perspectives. And so, I guess I got to a point where, the PTSD, and I think that we all have post-traumatic stress disorder, except it's not post, it's ongoing. Just open your web browser each day and read the news and look at what's happening to the country, look at what's happening to the environment, look at what's happening to people fighting for racial justice. Like I just described, it's traumatic even just reading about it, let alone being hit by the specific car. And then another aspect of a dear friend of mine, he refers to it as post-colonial stress disorder, talking about it from an indigenous perspective. But again, that's not post, that that's happening and it's affecting all of us. And how to deal, for me, I think, with those feelings is I had to just really, really open up and do a lot of deeper grief work in order to get through that to a point of acceptance of what's happening. And that acceptance has been a byproduct for me of a willingness to let myself really grieve for what's going on, and not acceptance from a tolerance perspective, like, oh, it's okay for this to continue, but just like accept that, okay, this is what's happening, and then now wait and listen to what I'm going to do next. So for me, grief has served as a portal for those of us who know what's happening on and to the planet, to that we get to walk through, I think, every single day, and find a way to do that and keep evolving with it. And then lastly, I feel like it really behooves all of us to develop, and I've had to develop a really intimate relationship with grief, especially looking at what's happening. And as we go forward from here, kind of like what Wes mentioned in the previous section, of as we start to bump more and more, the population is bumping up against the edge of the petri dish, as it were. So what happens is we start going deeper into a really global depopulation that will result from climate crisis impacts, and the levels of griefs that are going to come are going to be just only become more intense. I mean, look at the world today and imagine where it was just 1 year ago. I mean, it's just, that's the rapidity that we're up against, and probably is going to continue to accelerate. So alongside that, for me, is really a requisite grounding deeper into really having my grief and then coming back into that guidance. And so I was just kind of chatting a little bit with Sonali right before the session started that, I now live on the Olympic Peninsula, so I'm always consistently planning, okay, how can I get back out into the mountains again, and where, because it's only there can I kind of tap back in and recenter and really maintain that kind of broader perspective on things, and then listen about how am I going to respond to that? What can I do? What kind of work can I do for the earth, including for her people going forward?
That's beautiful. Thank you, Dar. And it reminds me of a poem that I wanted to share that was sent to me by one of our participants right before the session began. And it's a poem that they wrote. It's a poem by Angus Wright, a really wonderful longtime friend and contributor to the Land Institute and member of the board of directors. And this poem is titled Climate Change, and it speaks to grief. I'm just going to read it. It's short. We are fortunate who are allowed an untempered grief for the loss of our mothers and fathers. How unspeakably sad we are to imagine that our children's grief for our loss will be tempered with regret and suffered with a bitter taste of an empty larder. And I think that in these words, Angus is writing about the grief and pain that is happening now, but is also what some people have called a kind of anticipatory grief, an imagining of the future and a feeling in advance of what that might be like emotionally, but also materially. And I think that this connects to the next question that I wanted to ask both of you, which is about, as we experience and are willing to face the emotions that we're feeling, and as we ground ourselves and look to different ecological systems and communities and places for guidance, as we learn from mushrooms and listen to mountains, how can we work with our emotions in a fluent way that pushes forward movement that is courageous? So I think that especially in the sort of self-care lingo of today, a lot of this work becomes sort of inward facing. And I think this connects to something we discussed in the very first session about self-criticism and what it means to sort of become very inwardly focused, but how do you then channel this work outward? So I'm curious for both of you, how the places that you're working with and the feelings that you're willing to feel become embodied in courageous actions, and where you're looking for and finding, maybe in some unexpected places, examples of courage in action today. So maybe Carmen, if you'd be willing to lead off.
Sure. Yeah, for me, courage is actually coming from a place of experimentation, figuring out what alternatives are to broken system. I mean, I think it's easier to say how things aren't working, that it's easier to point out what doesn't work. It's very accessible to say these are the pitfalls. But what do we do in creating an alternative? I have found a lot of relief in like letting go of trying to hold up an old system, of trying to like fight for redeeming it in any way, or redeeming the atrocities that have happened. I hear a lot of white communities talk about like reconciliation and forgiveness. And I feel like I understand that the intention of those things is genuine, but really I think the best policy is to like let it go, stop trying to save something that cannot be saved. It's a sinking ship. And so for me, I am like willing to let go of kind of fighting in a way that doesn't serve something new that I cannot see. Because there's always a possibility of renewal. There's a possibility of life in this situation, no matter how terrible it might seem. But me as human, I'm not sure if I even have the capacity to understand what that regenerative process is going to look like. So it's been very beneficial to let go and stop trying to hold on to the sinking ship. And the courage really comes from the journey of being willing to start at zero all over again, go out into nature, go out into the mind, into the heart, the spirit, and begin a new journey of figuring out where meaning is now. Where does life derive? From what point is growth possible? This is not to say that deconstructing like our infrastructure isn't an important part. I still do that. But courage, the real courage, comes from being willing to know nothing in this situation and being willing to listen to the environment and try to create an antithesis, try to create something meaningful to grow from.
Really speaks to me and my thinking about and feeling of what unlearning is like and has been like. Thank you, Carmen. Dar, would you like to respond on this idea of courage?
Yeah, I thank you, Carmen. That's the perfect dovetail right where you left off there, because I just had my note on this is openness, just and the story I'll share around that is I was working on the conclusion of the End of Ice, and I had, the book essentially surveys all the different ways that the earth is in a state of collapse, you know, from forests to coral reefs to glaciers to the Amazon and all these places. I got to a point and I was absolutely sure there's no way humans make it past this. You know, there's just no way. And I was absolutely certain. And the big lesson for me was it was right around then that, and not coincidentally, that I met Stan Rushworth, a Native American elder, enrolled citizen of the Chiricahua Apache Nation, and I met Stan, and I shared my perspective, my certainty of there's no way humans are going to make it past this. And he said, you know, that's the same hubris, that certainty that got us to this point. And you think you can predict, you, this one guy, I don't care what, despite your research and all this, that you can predict what's going to happen to our species, let alone some other species, you know, on this big, giant, complex planet that we know so little about, you know, from a scientific perspective. And it really put me in my place, and it really challenged me in a good way to see, you know, to say, no, I can't say that for sure. I absolutely can't say that. And that the importance of having enough humility, I think that's, you know, interestingly, that's part of courage, is having enough humility to be, I don't know, I'm open. And I think that's why I have to consistently go out into the mountains. And when I'm there, just listening, sometimes overtly asking to be shown, okay, what's the next thing for me to do to serve? And then listen, because I don't know, you know, and my best, you know, coming back to that guidance, my best ideas come to me, or they're given to me. It's not like I think them up or I figure something out. It comes, I'm being guided, you know, that it necessarily entails from something else that's not me. And so the essence of that is that openness, or knowing nothing. And I think that's a really, really great place to be, because, you know, none of us here even know what's going to happen tomorrow, looking at how fast everything's going. So really it's left to the, you know, holding on or trying to maintain something is madness, and let alone an exercise in futility. And the only logical thing to do is openness, and to continue to let go and listen, and then also act on what comes in, you know. And I think that's another part where the courage comes in, to act on it no matter what it is, you know. And for me, at one point, it meant throwing myself to the front lines of Iraq, and then reporting on that off and on for 10 years. And then now it's working on another book project with Stan to, you know, bring more attention to Indigenous voices. And for each one of us, it's going to be a different and evolving thing.
Maybe before we transition to a respondent, I just wanted to, Dar, you've been able to speak a little bit about where your work is going and this upcoming project. And Carmen, I wanted you to be able to share as well. Is there a direction that your action and engagement is moving you right now? Or where are you looking to lead or join or follow when we think about courageous action at this moment?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. I was just thinking about, we were able to hear some about Dar's project that he's working on and where his work is moving. And I was curious if you also wanted to share anything about where action is taking you, whether that's a tangible project or just a direction, whether that's something you're leading or something that you're following or joining right now.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like a multitude of things, but I definitely have been a part of a resistant community for a long time now, and resistance is still a part of my practice. It's still a part of learning, but I'm also kind of taking a leap to think about, you know, in what ways can I really apply these things? In what ways can I put these discoveries into action that might actually impact people? So I am going to grad school to study sustainable design and to think about in ways nature can inform larger systems and infrastructure, social infrastructure. So I kind of have this balancing act of going into these places of resistance, continuing to deconstruct and pull things apart and analyze. At the same time, willing to go into a new arena where I might not know very much, and try to experiment and explore in a way that could provide alternatives to the things that that I find discontent in. So I don't know. It's like moving in two extremes on opposite ends. Just doing that for myself and letting it develop as time moves on.
Wonderful. Mm-hmm. So we're going to start moving into some more broader discussion. And as we do that, I'll start encouraging people to enter questions into the Q&A box. If you'd like me to share those with Carmen and Dar, and we'll begin addressing them soon. But to begin the discussion, I'd like to introduce our respondent for this session, Dr. Sonali McDermott. I'm so delighted that Sonali is able to be here with us today. Sonali is an assistant professor in environmental studies at New York University who specializes in atmospheric science and climatology, and is engaged with different agricultural systems around the world and is very well versed in this moment of crisis and opportunity that we're in. So I'm excited to hear her thoughts and questions as we begin this conversation. Welcome, Sonali.
Thanks so much, Aubrey. Can you all hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this really fantastic and intimate session. And Carmen and Dar, thank you both so much for sharing all of that. I have two questions, one more targeted towards Dar and one more targeted towards Carmen. But of course, I would, if either of you have thoughts on the other question, please feel free and we can kind of go from there. Dar, I'll kind of start with you if you don't mind. I think it took a lot of courage and it seems like this is something you've been thinking about and grappling with for a long time, but I very much appreciate your willingness in this community and at large to talk about the PTSD that you've experienced, both in relation to war and to the challenges facing our ecosystems. And that takes a lot of courage. There was an article recently in Vox by David Roberts that highlighted what Daniel Pauly, who's one of the premier ocean conservationists in the world, coined, I think, in the 90s of shifting baselines, right? This idea that the experience of the next generations of people, in that case, he was talking about, fish stocks and fishermen, would experience a whole new reality compared to what previous generations had experienced, and therefore may not appreciate the loss to some extent. And I bring that up because I teach college, some just amazing students who are far smarter than I was when I went to college. And there is a general feeling, particularly in my climate change class, of maybe not resignation, but a deep anger, a deep sense of being betrayed. And maybe for some students, maybe a good portion of the students' resignation. Now, this also occurs at the same time that we've got the Sunrise Movement and Extinction Rebellion and a lot of youth-oriented movements where they are engaging their anger, I think, in really constructive ways. And so, but that being said, these, our youth, right, our younger generations, of course, are experiencing shifting baselines, right? They grew up in a world, or growing up in a world, that already has, somewhat of a dearth of the ecosystems and functionality that we experienced growing up. So I wonder what you would say and how you would take your experiences are of feeling that grief and translate that for a younger generation who might not have that baseline of grief to experience, and how to still kind of grapple with this loss in the face. Like, do you actually need that grief in some ways, or that experience to understand loss, or to understand what action needs to be taken? If you could just comment on that, I'd be curious to hear.
Yeah, thanks for the easy question. That is a great question and really, really challenging too. Another story, last summer, a nephew of mine came up to visit. He was having some struggles at home. He's 17 years old, and he wanted to come up. He knows how I live, and his folks agreed. Yeah, we'll send him up to Uncle Dar's. And the first thing that came to my mind is I need to take him out on a backpacking trip. And we went out there, and I listened to him, and I listened to him talk, and he shared a lot of that. He shared a lot of, look, I'm 17 and I don't read the news. I don't know half what you know about the climate. He knew about my book. And, but I know that my generation's screwed, that's how he put it. And we don't know what to do. And we're angry at you guys. And we see what's going on and the continued degradation. And, it was really important for me to just listen and just like, yeah, you should feel that way, absolutely. And then just really express my own experience of, because I don't care how old he is, like that's grief, what he's experiencing, and for me, I had to understand that level of rage that I felt and sometimes still do feel, often actually, pretty much every time I read the news, is part of grief and part of trauma. Now I would go ahead and call it that too, because it is traumatizing to understand that these things translate to mean loss of giant chunks of the biosphere, and that's pretty scary. And so just listening to him and offering solidarity, and then just letting him know that I'm here and I'm engaged in the struggle too, in this as part of this transition that we're trying to make and be open to, and just let him know that I'm here for him no matter what happens. And we communicate, not that much because he's 17, but we do communicate. And I think the most important thing is I just let him know that the door is open and he can call and we can talk anytime, or he can come back up. Well, not now with COVID, but because he lives in Austin, but in the future, post-pandemic, inshallah, he could come. But I think the main thing is just for me was just really solidarity with that grief and understanding, like, yep, we're all in this together, and ultimately we're all, we're on one planet here, and all of us are in the same boat, and then just letting them know that it is part of this big transition that is forced upon us now, and that we're all going through whether we like it or not.
Thank you so much.
Sonali, I wonder whether you would also speak to that same question. I'm just thinking about the way that your teaching might have evolved. I know, I told you could ask questions, but I'm gonna ask you one instead. I know that your teaching has evolved and changed and I imagine, like, as you work with this as a researcher and as a scientist, I'm just curious if you might share that. I'm imagining many people would be interested. I certainly am.
Yeah, now you've inspired me to ask easier questions. No, and actually, my answer to that question, I think my answer to that question might lead into my question for Carmen, actually. So that's kind of a nice segue. So I'll be honest. So I've taught my climate change class now at NYU for the past 6 years, and I actually told our director of undergraduate studies that this would be the last year I'm teaching climate change. And I'm going to reorient the course. And part of that is because, not that I don't think it doesn't need to be taught, but it's a hard subject to teach. I don't have a lot of things to share that I find to be hopeful, that don't feel trite, to these students, these super smart, right, strategic students who are in environmental studies and thinking about this already, right? They don't need to hear solution, like the solution space in the way that we conventionally talk about it. And, and I think Carmen has a unique approach that I want to ask about. But so I'm instead, trying to find ways, that doesn't mean that people don't need a general education in climate. That's not what I mean to say, but I'm reorienting the course to really be focused on the intersection of climate and ecosystems. I'm going to probably call it something like climate and life instead of climate change. And the idea there is, I feel that one way to one way to channel grief and anger and to evoke courage is through inspiration. And what inspires me, right, I often tell people I get very irritated by having to study climate change. I'm a climate scientist. I'm not a climate change scientist, right? It kind of sucks that I have to take what I'm passionate about and study how it's changing so rapidly that I could barely understand what those changes, be able to predict and understand those changes. I could barely understand the changes. I could barely understand the dynamics as they stood, right? Let alone under changing conditions. And so if I start from a place of what inspires me, which is the intersection between climate and life, right? Ecosystems and climate, and how they feed back on one another, perhaps then we can get to a place of acknowledging how amazing life is, right, on this planet, and how important it is for our climate system. And then when we experience the grief part of the course together, it might inspire a love, right? In fact, I've heard often from people who are way smarter than I am that grief is a manifestation of love, right? And how can you grieve properly if you didn't love? And part of not loving in some ways is not experiencing. So if I can bring that experience into the classroom in a way that's not just talking about climate change, I'll be happy. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but that's sort of the way that I'm approaching taking my students on a journey that I've had, right? In solidarity, of course. And if you don't mind, so actually that kind of brings me to the question that I had for Carmen, which, I think your talk was kind of this, sorry, the bugs. Your talk is was just this amazing ode to what inspires you, right? And how we really should be inspired. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about sort of most people in the world these days are living in cities, they're living in urban environments. They may not have the interaction with natural ecosystems, although there's an entire urban ecology that's rising. How do you get inspiration in sort of the Anthropocene, right? And these new human crafted worlds, particularly if you're in your youth and most of your world is online right now, all our worlds are online. How does inspiration play into courage for you, Carmen? And, and I there's a part of me that thinks the fact that we haven't included mycelium-based thinking in our design is a failure of imagination, right? And what that can do. And so I'm just wondering, like, how do you overcome that? Like, how do you find inspiration? How do you overcome, a situation where you can't find inspiration in order to be inspired, and then start integrating these new ideas into your design? Something, I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm hoping you can speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm just gonna run with this. I'm actually gonna start from the negative and kind of integrate into the other topics that we were talking about. So in thinking about, I'm a millennial, I'm 34 years old, thinking about these younger generations kind of clashing with older generations. This is definitely a part of my experience. I will major clash with boomers, to all the boomers out there. Which it's not a point of like disrespect, or that there isn't something to be offered by all of our elders, because I really believe that there are, but it's more about passing the baton. And I get this feeling that older generations whose lives and identity have been completely built around capital really don't want to let go, and they really don't want to pass the baton. And it's very hard, especially as a person of color, as a person of a lower class. I'm just looking at the baton and I'm like, if you don't pass it, like, I'm gonna take it. And if you don't let me take it, nature's gonna have its way with you. And I think that's very hard for people to hear. I think it's very difficult. And it's just like that mushroom busting through the concrete. This is our reality. That's physical reality. Nature, it's like Jurassic Park, life finds a way. Like, the more you try to control, the harder it's going to become for you to transform. And I feel like I just want to beg older populations, let go. Just let go, and try to start from ground zero. And elders have something to teach us, but young people have something to teach elders. And I do not get the sense that the elder community is really ready or willing to listen. And just to kind of respond and what these differences are and what they look like, we're not all in it together. That's a false narrative, okay? The planet's heating up. We could go through disaster. That's going to be completely different for a Black man who's incarcerated in prison. It's going to be completely different for a child, a migrant child kept in a cage. When everybody's scrambling around trying to find food or something because systems are starting to break down, surviving climate change and the planet changing like that isn't the same for everybody. So this is not, we cannot talk about environmental justice without talking about colonialism, without talking about race and equity. These narratives that we're all in it together are overarching white narratives that are really the folly of the system. And if we aren't ready to like acknowledge those things, those green actions or initiatives will never happen. They will not be possible for people and majority white liberals that are invested in these ideas. So in order to really take into consideration, you know, how the planet can transform and how we can transform as a human species, we have to unravel, we have to pull on the string, and we have to understand exactly what put us in that situation. And that has a lot to do with colonialism, Western society, market domination of land, domination of people, exploitation of land and people. And there's just a lot of work to do because that's the reality of the situation. And people of color, our communities are resilient and they're coming for your baton. And if they don't take it, the planet is going to. So let go.
Actually, that's a great point. I actually heard this amazing Indigenous activist in Canada. She's pretty famous, and I can't recall her name at the moment. This is the first time I heard her, but she had a great quote speaking to your point. She said, we're not all in the same boat. We're in the same storm, and some of us don't even have a boat. And I just thought that was a great encapsulation of, I think, what it is you're speaking to. So I appreciate that, definitely. Mm-hmm. So I could, of course, go on and explore and explore and explore, but I'm sure there are many members of the community. Aubrey, I'm going to defer to you as to how you want to move on from this or not, and I'm more than happy to keep asking questions of these two.
Yeah, I'm seeing just a couple of questions start to come in, so maybe I'll give people another minute or two to enter some more questions in. Maybe Sonali, would you like to ask one more question, and then we'll start going to the Q&A?
Yeah, and so, you know, and there's so many places we can go from just the questions that you know, from your responses in these questions. I suppose you know, one of the questions that I get a lot whenever I'm speaking is, you know, what can I do at home? And this question actually bothers me to no end. And in fact, I heard one really great, I think the head of 350.org in Brooklyn said something like, well, I think the one thing that we could all do as individuals is stop acting so individually and like start acting collectively. And so I'm not going to ask you both, what can I do at home to engage in any of this? But what I do want to ask you both in a very as specific as you could possibly answer this are, and Carmen, maybe you're a good person to start with, just in terms of like, and I know this is something that you didn't want to focus your talk on, but you know, your last slide, right, where you had a kind of a community engagement, right, around some of the work. What do you see as a prime barrier to inspiration, to working with some of these things? I mean, is it really urbanization and people not engaging with the landscape as much? Is it what, you know, and I know it's easy to just jump to like, well, it's systemic, you know, issues and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering, let's say in your community, right? What are some of the barriers that you are just thinking about? Like what's on your mind in terms of what needs to be fixed first? Or at least something that needs some point of focus there.
Yeah, oh, that's so hard. I think education. Narratives are controlled by public education systems. There's so many barriers to entry, but to list a few, you know, like POC communities coming together to try to defend themselves or create spaces of healing. there's so many things that are kind of on the docket. I think that the biggest barrier is time, because you're talking about communities trying to come together and heal trauma, like hundreds of years of trauma, slavery, servitude, continuation of that. Not to mention that communities, a lot of communities have lost their languages. They've lost all these ways that their culture was built. Within their flesh is hundreds of years of knowing land the way that their culture knew land, expressing life and perceiving it the way that they were adopted, and then language, which is speaking the words to communicate those things. And so there's a huge breakdown in communication. There's time is working against people. So even if we're starting the journey of this work, we have, climate change or possible climate disaster happening simultaneously. But I don't know, I guess for almost every POC kind of community and my own, I think it's isolation, because people are continuing that, we're continuing to be isolated and not to be together or be in our communities. And when POC communities do show resistance, the government or the military ends up kind of breaking those communities in violent ways. And so there's constant isolation, there's constant barriers, including money, being able to have capital to come together, being able to have space to come together, education. Essentially, we need to break systems that isolate communities of color so that they can regenerate or heal.
I love how it's like that's such a isolation is such a strong, powerful term, right? In terms of like, I've never heard anyone describe a barrier as isolation that way. And I think that's something that we should all just keep in mind in terms of like the action points around how do you actually, start to break down that barrier of isolation. That's really fantastic. Dar, I'm curious from your experience and even your very personal experience, right, with the kind of on this road of recovery, what you feel some of the barriers might be. I guess and that could even be as specific as kind of barriers to dealing with your anger on loss in these ways, or even something more general, but yeah, as it's informed by your experiences.
Well, I think when I look out, having reported so long from a war zone and then for a long time on the climate crisis, and, I look at, when I see what's happening across the world today, I see it as all symptomatic of system failure. The Western colonial model was failed before it even started, just what we've heard in these other sessions of the separation from the earth, separation from each other, that whole mindset, where it came from, everything, and everything like what Wes was talking about in the previous section. It's system failure. And it's of course in the US, for example, as this system, as these people try to hold on to that system and grip that power, we see increasing oppression and repression and violence, and that's going to increase. What I saw in Iraq of, people driving car bombs into demonstrators or buildings. Well, we've had dozens of fascists driving cars into protests here. Like, what's the difference? These cars aren't exploding, at least not yet. So it's the system trying to maintain control. And so I think this is where the grief comes in, where we get caught up in anger and rage and fighting against each other and identity politics and all of this. This is separation. This is a barrier, making gloss statements about one race or the other, or elders versus non-elders or any of that. I think that's dangerous territory, and that adds to separation instead of, okay, look, we're all on one planet, and what is each of ours to do? And I believe when I talk about that listening, of going out onto the land to listen, that way, if in theory, my little pipe dream is, and this is probably me being overly idealistic, which continues to happen, is that if we all listen really well and really closely to whatever our guidance is. You know, I mean, Carmen's is clearly where she gets hers. I'm really clear where I get mine. And each one of us is going to have that and probably already knows what it is, especially this crew. And then we're going to get that guidance, and that's coming directly from Earth or Spirit or whatever you want to call it. And in that way, Earth is the great organizer. And so I think that is the way to get through the barrier, you know. And I don't know, I'm not even going to pretend I have answers about what to do or how to deal with all of these converging crises. It's just, I just literally ask each day, how can I be of service? And what is my next thing to do to serve? And it just happens to be working with an elder, a Native American elder, on a book, bringing Indigenous voices to the fore as the next project. And I'm super grateful for that, because if I didn't have that, honestly, I don't know what I would do now. And in a way, it was easier to throw myself onto the front lines of Iraq. You know, I mean, that was a very easy, physically tangible thing to go do. And all the trauma that went with it and everything, that's in a way, though, that was easier than sitting here wondering, okay, like which fire to put out, because all of them are raging infernos at this point, and which way, you know, what to do. So I think really it's just, it comes back to that guidance, you know, because there are so many barriers. And again, you know, back to the grief piece, if I don't let myself have that really, really, you know, grieve what's going on a daily basis and then come out the other side of that, I'm literally not going to be able to listen, and I'm definitely not going to be able to see clearly.
No, thanks very much. I have one last question, but Aubrey, I want to defer to you too, because I want to leave enough time for what's in the Q&A.
I think you should go ahead and ask your question in this flow. Go ahead, Simone.
Okay. So it's a last question, and it's the question that annoys me the most. So now that I can ask questions of somebody else, I'm going to ask all the questions that normally annoy me. And I say this in a very serious way, though, right? My question is, are you both hopeful in this moment? In some ways, we're more isolated than ever. And in other ways, look at this platform. I would never have met you had we all just had things been normal, in the sense that, you know, we weren't isolated due to COVID. So in some senses, the door has opened for a level of connection that we didn't have before. And we're in a time where we're all forced inside our homes, and yet these protests have been shown to be among the largest that we've had, these demonstrations, right, in recent history. And so my question is, are you hopeful? And I say this is an annoying question, and maybe it's not annoying for a lot of people, but I myself have a very complicated relationship with hope, and I have a lot of, I don't have a lot, and this is coming from a purely personal standpoint, I don't have a lot of patience for the word in who I am. I believe in doing what's right, and doing that regardless of what the outcome might be, even if the outcome's not all that hopeful in a conventional sense. So that question tends to just, I don't know what that question means often. So I'm going to pose that question to you. Are you both hopeful? And you can answer it just yes or no, or you can choose to answer it in a more caveated way, as I have done. But I'm just curious to hear your response in light of everything that's going on right now. And Carmen, how about we start with you, and then we'll end on. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to say in a really binary terms. I'm hopeful about regenerative processes for the earth. I think it's far more powerful than what humans could even assume it to be. But the transformation, the things that are changing and happening right now, sociopolitically, I firmly believe that those changes won't happen without acts of violence. When power sources are held, no one just gives up power. They don't just say, oh, you were right, here you go. Communities have to claim that and have to liberate themselves. And so in thinking about, you know, what it means to be a POC artist or a POC ecologist, I'm hopeful in that way, in the ways that it is possible for my reality and my community's reality and our cultural history to endure these things as they have endured throughout history. But I do think that change and transformation will be a turbulent and violent one. But right now, we're still in a place of negotiation. We still can negotiate a lot of these things. And it is our choice how we negotiate them, what we call to action, and what we do. So in terms of emergent theory, maybe there's a lot of possibilities for hope that aren't foreseeable by any human. And that's essentially the definition of probably of hope or faith or optimism, is that like life is possible in ways that are not foreseen. So yeah, let's hope that there is a way through this that isn't a continuation of the trauma and grief that we know has been so devastating in the past. And just wait and see, I guess. No way to really predict the future.
Thank you. Yeah. Dar?
Thanks, Sonali. I'll go with the caveat bit. I really struggled with the hope versus hopelessness thing when I got to the end of my climate book, because it just seemed, like I shared earlier, like all is lost. And so I kind of wrestled with it a bit. I'm just going to read a couple of really short quotes. One's from Stephen Jenkinson, a Canadian storyteller and author and teacher. And he worked in the palliative care industry for several decades, so got to wrestle a lot with death and letting go. And he said, the great enemy of grief is hope. Hope is a 4-letter word for people who are willing to know things for what they are. Our time requires us to be hope-free, to burn through the false choice of being hopeful and hopeless. They are two sides of the same con job. Grief is required to proceed. And then the other quote that I'd like to read comes from Václav Havel, where he said, hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing no matter how it turns out. And so what I realized also about hope is that for me, it was attached to like expectations or having expectations of certain results from my actions. And so that's where hope came in. Well, if I do this, or if we as a movement do this, X is going to happen. And I had to let go of the results of my actions, because P.S., I never had control of that anyway. It never will. All I can control is my next right action. And so I found a lot of solace in freedom and liberation, and reason to get out of the bed in the morning from knowing how dire the climate situation is, to, okay, what am I going to do? Am I going to just like, okay, screw it, we've lost, it's over, it's too late? No, I owe I owe so much to future generations of all species. So what am I going to do to serve? So I just keep coming back to that, and if I'm busy, what is my next right action? What's the next thing that guidance is telling me to do? Guidance out there, as we've discussed, to serve. Then I'm too busy doing that work, and having hope in that context is really none of my business.
Thank you both for your powerful, powerful responses to that. Aubrey, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Sonali, and thank you both, Carmen and Dar. I do have a couple more questions, so I hope that you're willing to entertain them. And the first one is from M in the Q&A. And she asked about what leaders in these fields, and what do you as leaders in your fields, as writers and artists, need to do in order to make this type of thinking, these ideas, stay front and center. So how do we keep these types of conversations centered, rather than in a post-COVID world, things slipping back to a normal that is not the normal that we want to return to? How do we keep our momentum as we have this conversation today, but then return to our lives?
I have no idea.
For me, the conversation has been centered for long before COVID. So I guess there's no normal, there's no standard that we come back to. Time is always moving and time is always changing, and you can choose to move with it, or choose to define yourself by, you know, interpretations of the past. But there's no more going back to a stasis of comfortability before this. And so we just move forward.
Mm. And maybe a way to follow up and elaborate on that too. In the framing of that question, it's really about, it is a question about what do people need? And another one of the questions in the Q&A from Julianne is similarly asking, you know, what do you hear that young people are asking for? And I wonder whether this might be, we might take a few moments to reflect on this in the context of these 4 sessions we've had over the last few days, as we've, you know, had these fairly wide-ranging conversations about what learning and unlearning means, about some of the very material, but I also sort of psychological ideas of limits and the power of those, as we heard and have been talking about this sort of much longer view of human relationships with the planet, preceding and after. And I'm wondering whether you might both help us weave some of these things together and maybe tie them to courage, not in the form of what the answer is, of what do we need now, here's the answer, here's how to boil this down, but instead of naming maybe some of the questions that have emerged, or the questions that other people are asking of you that you don't have the answers to yet, or the questions that have come up for you over the last several days, that are kind of, as Wes would so brilliantly say, the questions that push us beyond what we knew, push us outside of that, into new spaces, or the questions that pry us open in ways that are good. What questions might be coming up for you?
I guess for me, it's not so much questions or like a mental journey. It's really a guttural journey. So thinking about the original neural network, which actually starts in your stomach. This is like a place of feeling. I think for everyone, it should be a place of grief, and it is a place of like deep pain for every human on the planet too. So to be able to move through that is something I hadn't experienced like in my lifetime. I think, you know, as I think in history, you know, people who live through atrocities and war or genocide, I think about what it's like to move through that place of pain and grief. But in some sense, beyond just the feeling, I think the thing that pulls me forward is just knowing that even rebirth, you know, birth itself is a violent process. This is a part of reality. This is a part of nature. And I don't want to defer pain. I don't want to defer the things that will come with this transformative process. I just want to be present and move through it in a way that isn't seeking control, but observing and taking those observations and turning them into actions that I can do as one person.
I keep coming back to, I'm sorry, I'm sounding like probably a broken record, but just listening and how can I keep being of service, you know, because I feel like the situation is so extreme now, and so much suffering and really system collapse essentially is what we're in. And I think COVID is accelerating this dramatically and will continue to do so. And it just, for me, it's about continuing to find new ways to listen. And one of those is working now with Stan on the project that we talked about very briefly earlier. It's talking to people who, you know, from his perspective is like, look, welcome to our world. We're, you know, we've survived diseases that were inflicted upon us by settlers and colonialists. We've survived a genocide. All these things. We survived the ongoing continuance of the erasure, attempted erasure of indigenous people on Turtle Island. And we're still here. And so to me, it's listening to wisdom and pragmatic experience that comes from people like that. And so my response is, again, and I feel ridiculously lucky to have the opportunity to just work in a position to bring what I can to help get those voices down on paper and get them out as literally a pragmatic, practical user's guide for people who are going to read it, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike. So it's, I don't know, it's such unprecedented times. I mean, and you know, it's like, in my world, when I became politicized and decided to go cover Iraq as a war reporter, to really try to show what was happening to the Iraqi people as a result of US policy, that was, crazy as it sounds, a simpler time. And because in my world, that one war was the single most important thing on the planet. And now it's like, pick a war, right? I mean, how many do we have going at once? I mean, they're innumerable because the system is so ubiquitous and out of control, and also simultaneously in a collapse, and therefore reaching out to grab and hold on to power as it can, because power never concedes power. So that's the world that we're living in. And so what do we do and where do we go from here? And I don't know, the longer I work on as a writer and having been working on social justice and environmental issues, the more questions I have than answers. So I have no idea if I even touched on answering that question right now, but that's what came up.
Thank you, and thank you both. And I think that, you know, what your refrain of listening is really important, and maybe a nice place for us to bring a few of the threads of this gathering together, because this has certainly been a unique Ecosphere Studies experience for me in particular. When I think about the ways in which I normally would be very much in a place rather than the internet, and rather where I would be seeing everyone rather than watching a chat stream, and we would be communicating in affective as well as intellectual ways together. And I think that the experience I imagine many people have had has been a sort of listening and learning type of mode for this event. And in this current moment, speaking about listening and learning can feel so passive and unsatisfying, like, oh, we're just listening and learning, and actually things that need to happen and need to be happening. And we often oppose listening and learning to action. But what I hope that these type of conversations have shown is that that's a very impoverished way of understanding what both listening and learning can be. I think listening can be an incredibly active experience. It can take us in the place that Carmen was suggesting, and in terms of a willingness to let go. Actually deeply listening can be a way of feeling those sort of stories or structures break down in one's mind that opens yourself to new possibilities. And I think that, you know, as we've been speaking about with real learning and learning in community, that can take time, and sometimes going slow through that and being willing to sit with things, as Wendell Berry advised himself as a poet, can be a way to actually accelerate and scale action going forward, if it's coming from a very deeply rooted place, and an openness to something that's much more imaginatively rich, and that's informed by the best of what we know and the most honest reckonings of what we know about the state of the planet, rather than throwing our hands up. So I think that there's so much to reflect on in this gathering, and I hope that these conversations will continue, and that I'll get a chance to have many more conversations with everyone who's been a part too. We will be in touch once we post the session recordings, and I encourage people to reach out to me and to each other through the participant list and to keep these conversations going. I hope that old relationships have been renewed with each other and with the land, and that maybe some new collaborations and ideas, the seeds have been planted or sparked. And it only seems fitting in these last few moments that we conclude not with another talking head on a screen, but with someone who delights in music and expression. And I'm really excited to introduce a musician whose songs are touchstones for me. You might remember Eliza Gilkinson from her performance at last year's Prairie Festival at the Land Institute. Eliza is a folk singer, twice nominated for Grammy Awards, and a voice of courage and compassion. Her most recent album is titled 2020. And I'll thank you again one more time, everyone, for being here. And Eliza, thank you for being with us. I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you guys. I've been listening to this, and I have several times cried. So now I've got to get my shit together and be here with you. You've touched me. All of you have really touched me today. So I've got a couple of songs to sing to you all, and maybe tie into everything that has been before us today. I've been crying in the dark of night. I can't find my way to sleep. Thoughts and prayers will never make things right. And I have promises to keep. I've been hoping there'll be some way through, and all our loved ones will be fine. No one knows what it'll come down to, so I'm just looking for a sign. We're on fire. I've been calling on my angel choir to put some wings upon my feet. Fill me up with inspiration's fire and get me out into the street. I've been following the brightest star, letting my conscience be my guide. There's no road map gonna tell us where we are, but the fire of love burns deep inside. And I've been crying in the dark of night, with miles to go before I sleep. Thoughts and prayers will never make things I'm looking at, hi, you guys. Is there a way to look at me so I don't have to look at myself while I'm saying speaker view? There.
I'll keep my screen on so you can hear me smiling and clapping, Eliza.
I just let myself, I made myself go away. That was good. It's so hot here. My guitar is going out of tune while I'm just hanging here. All right, here's another song that I feel like has something to do with what was discussed here today. Weary world, worn and tired from all the pleasures we required. Spin us round from end to end, break us down until we bend. And with these hearts and with these hands, could we learn to love again? Weary world, make us pay, make us beg for one more day, one more day, and one more night, one more chance to get it right. And with these hearts, with these hands, could we learn to love again? Weary world, so now we know, as in heaven, so below. Forgive us now, don't let us go. Weary world, may it be so. And with these hearts, with these hands, could we learn to love again? With these hearts, with these hands, could we learn to love again? Love again. Love again.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Take care, everybody, and please be in touch. We look forward to seeing you soon.